Okay. Good evening and welcome to another biography event. My name is Ziolkowski and I'm the Associate Director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support of the center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will be Thursday, May 27th. That's this Thursday at 6 p.m. when Kai Bird will have a discussion with Zachary Karabell about Inside Money, Brown Brothers Harriman, and the American Way of Power. Please mark your calendars and register for this free event on the Leon Levy website. But tonight, I am delighted to be here to celebrate Susan Bernofsky and her biography of Swiss modernist author Robert Walser. I have my copy here, and I'm going to post a link so that you can order it on bookshops.org. A 2012-2013 Leon Levy Center for Biography Fellow, Bernofsky is the translator of 7 works of fiction by Walser, as well as Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis and Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, which was a big book for me in high school. She is currently at work on a new translation of Thomas Mann's monumental novel, The Magic Mountain. She is the author of Foreign Words, Translator Authors in the Age of Goethe, and the recipient of numerous awards, including the Helen and Kurt Wolff Translators Prize and the Hermann Hesse Translation Prize. Her translation of Jenny Erpenbeck's novel, The End of Days, 2014, won the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, the Schlegel-Tieck Translation Prize, the Unger Award for Literary Translation, and the Oxford Weidenfeld Translation Prize. Her translation of Yoko Tawada's novel Memoirs of a Polar Bear, 2016, won the inaugural Warwick Prize for Women in Translation. She directs the program in literary translation in the MFA writing program at Columbia University. Welcome, Susan. Welcome back, I guess I should say.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be back. The entire Leon Levy said it was such an important part of the journey of this book that it's really a thrill to get to launch it here with you.
Oh,
I'm
great.
so grateful.
Well, it's great to have. I wasn't there then, unfortunately, but I'm getting to know you now, and it's great to have you back. So talk a bit about your translation work. What sort of writers you're drawn to, why you're drawn to them, how translation, such a unique form of intimacy, literary intimacy, the granularity of it, especially when it comes to a writer as self-reflexive as Walser, how that can be a precursor to biography. What translation offered you as a biographer?
Thank you. I love this question. It's also really interesting because, I would say that the sorts of writers that I've really been drawn to as a translator are the ones who are really obsessed with language and like thick language and quirky, unusual language that isn't just being used as if it were a transparent medium through which one might tell a story, but the writers for whom language is, the part of the meat of the story. And, literary modernism is all about this. And, writers like Yoko Tawada, Jenny Erpenbeck pursue this kind of relationship with language, I feel. And so, it scratches a certain sort of itch for me to work on, in this way, writers who really are exploring all the capabilities of language to create worlds. And having, spent so many years, in fact, more than 3 decades working on Robert Walser as a translator, it created a really strange situation, which I didn't even realize was happening when I first approached the biography, which, as I was joking with you before we launched this just now, was, kind of a extended act of fandom, as it were. But I had been spending so many years kind of getting inside his sentences that I started to feel that I knew something about how his mind worked and how, how he put together a sentence and, who he was. And part of the work of writing the biography for me was realizing how illusory this notion was that I knew who he was. And, his story taught me again and again that the ideas that I had based on having gotten inside the texture of his work were, part of the work he was creating. He's such a shapeshifter in his writing, and loves to, put masks on and talk you into believing he's this person and that person. And,
Hmm.
the Robert
So,
Walser I discovered in the process of researching and writing was different from what I thought. So that was humbling.
yeah, I was going to say it sounds humbling. I mean, I have such a vivid sense for him, having just finished the book. You do such a great job of getting across his personality and how kind of rebarbative and difficult he was, especially as he got older. Um, but what's interesting about that is that in order to translate Walser and difficult writers like that, you have to really be alert to all the ways in which the work creates its own world. And then it seems like the difference between the literary construct and the world itself, the social world, the historical world, the world of Switzerland in the turn of the century, is is really so vast. I mean, epistemologically, I guess, or something, that there's this huge gulf. And so you found yourself in a way in very foreign territory when you left the page and left the poetry.
Yeah. He also, he writes so much about what, there's something diaristic about a lot of his writing. He writes about so much of, what is going on right around him. But in fact, if you start to look for life context and the things he writes, it's all very slippery. A lot of current events are bracketed out, although he himself was very conscious of what was going on around him in the world.
So you talked a bit about fandom. How did the kind of devotion to him begin? Like, what was, like, there was this notion of the Walser mystique. Tell me a little about, or tell us a little about how he appeared to you as a literary phenomenon, and you got to be a fan, and then ultimately you wrote the book.
Well, he's the kind of writer that produces fans among readers. If you go to Switzerland and start looking at the places he's writing about, and places where he lives, you'll meet other Walserians on similar pilgrimages. He captured me very, very early, just as a reader, just by the quirkiness of his way of understanding the world and putting that into writing. There's just something about his voice that is so original. A really, I should have sharper descriptions for it at this point, but I still find it challenging to put into words exactly what it is that so captivates me, in his way of seeing the world. If you read the introduction to the book, that's me giving my best shot at really describing it, because he really is a really original voice. But the way he writes about around the margins of his own life, transforming it, like, he's the assistant, a novel in which he writes about working for this mad inventor, just sounds so fantastical, but was actually based on a real employment situation in a real place. And so I, like so many other Walser fans who go to Switzerland, travel to see that house, which is, half-hour train ride outside of Zurich, and, actually talked my way inside, crazily, as a young person, really, in my 20s. Now that house is inhabited by Bernhard Echte, a Walserian par excellence, who's, been researching and editing his work for decades. He now, lives and works in that house and runs a publishing house out of what used to be, the inventor's house. But, just the desire to do research around this this writer, it's not just limited to me. There were a lot of Walserians who do this. They want to go see the places. I really just wanted to see the place that was transformed in his work. And I went to see a whole lot of places, even before it was even like a thought that I might be writing about the places. I just wanted to see them.
Now he was, as a child, put to work very young. He was part of a middle-class family, but the family kind of went into decline during his youth, right? He was the sixth of 7 children, and he was apprenticed at age 14 as a clerk, as a kind of scribe, right? Writing very precise handwriting, transcribing business letters and so forth. And I was trying to think of another writer of his stature who has had so little formal education. You know, Melville, I could think he had to stop school at age 12 because his father gambled away the family fortune. But otherwise, I couldn't think of anyone. And yet you don't really feel he is particularly self-conscious about it. He, if anything, you know, it's a very class-saturated world and a very class-saturated biography. I think inevitably you make us very aware of how much, how hard it was for him to survive, and the peripatetic, and the pressure he was under beginning at age 14 just to make ends meet, and how often he moved, and the fate of his siblings and his mother. And talk a little about the whole drama of the economic dimension of his family. It's quite a heavy story in a way, looked at if you step back a bit, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this was a decisive moment in his formation as a writer, this sort of lost paradise of early childhood in prosperity, and which he particularly felt, I think, as a absence of worry, you know, the increasing worry that, you know, certainly he felt in his parents, but in the whole situation that culminated in him having to leave school, even though he was a particularly, you know, he was a straight A student. You know, I've seen his report cards, except for a moment, you know, there were moments when his grades fell off, you know, that coincide with a particularly rough move from, you know, a you know, more prosperous home to a decidedly less prosperous home. His grades fell off for a moment there, but he was an excellent student. And I do feel that he did carry around with him the consciousness of having had to finish his education on his own. You know, you see it in his emphasizing, you know, titles with, you know, Dr. Franz Blei, you know, he will call him doctor every time. And yes, that's the person who went and got a PhD, which is sort of the opposite of the person who leaves school at age 14. You know, there's an argument to be made, I think, that, you know, the emphatic, almost learnedness of his style at some points is, you know, a reaction to feelings about that. But it's also, you know, he has a lot of sort of clodhopper personas that he cultivates early in his career. And I think there is something defiant about that, you know. Even the decision to go to servant school, to say, you know, in a context in which I'm living among people of a certain social class, I am going to go seek a form of education that is sought by people of lower social classes, you know.
Right.
You
Well,
know,
tell
there's
a
defiance.
little bit about that story. I mean, the book is so wonderful in the sense of getting across a lot of literary history, like the Munich secession and Berlin at that point. And you do some great kind of thumbnail sketches of the cities and the era. And Musil, I mean, Walser comes into it as this outsider. He's Swiss, and he comes to these literary metropolises, but he's also a worker. He's very self-conscious in that way. And I think you're right. I think that his sensibility, the mockery and the irony, some of that is a defense mechanism. And he starts to play with a lot of the social categories and the titles and being an outsider in a way that is that is in dialogue or is that's reflective of his sense of being, um, um, you know, having the shortcoming of his
Yeah,
declining family status, right?
yeah,
So to talk a little about how he goes to Munich
yeah,
and then he goes to Berlin and his whole arc, it's because I don't know people have a
yeah,
sense of that.
yeah. I mean, so it's hard to, when we think about Walser today, we think about Robert Walser, but in his lifetime, his artist brother was infinitely more famous, particularly, you know, when Walser was a younger writer. His brother, Karl Walser, who was a year older, who the two of them had been incredibly close as young people. They both wanted to be artists. Young Robert wanted to be, you know, an actor, and then a playwright, and then a poet. And his brother encouraged him in this, and the brother was going to be an artist, which was, you know, also a grand aspiration for someone who had grown up for the latter part of childhood without much money. So he was taking this very impractical career path, but the brother sort of had paved the way for him in all these cities. The brother had been in Munich before him, and so he, you know, Robert Walser went to Munich and had introductions. And then in Berlin, when Robert Walser really settled there, his brother had become one of, or perhaps the most famous stage set designer, and was working for Max Reinhardt, very important theater director at the time, very prominent and moving in high society and getting patronage for his art. And, you know, he said, you know, little brother, you know, here, I have some coattails to spare. Let me help you launch your career. But their outsiderdom as Swiss people in Prussia, in Berlin, was huge. You know, very different sorts of accents, different social cues, different ways of belonging. And the big brother was very suave and used to going into places and making them his own, very handsome, and made friends easily. And Robert Walser was much more ill at ease. And in high society, certainly he, you know, these ways of behavior that he was expected to conform to felt all wrong, and he wasn't good at it. He was awkward. And so the decision to say, oh, screw it, let me just become a servant, was really kind of a slap in the face to his brother's attempts to lift him up along with himself into a sort of high sphere of high successful high society and patronage. Because, you know, the wealth of industrialists in Berlin was crucial for supporting the arts, and this patronage could be extended to a writer also. And it was just all very uncomfortable for
Yeah,
Robert.
I feel like I get the literary history of that era, the German speaking world, through this guy who's not going to make it. There's always that sense that he's not going to, that his brother is almost absurdly successful. I didn't realize how famous he was relative to Robert. And then Robert has some breaks. But then how old was he when he went to Butler School? 27, 26?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact age either, but it's
Mhm.
something like that.
Yeah. And he was there for a month and then he got a job immediately because he could speak French, right? And then he went up to some castle in what's now Poland and worked for a certain period as an assistant butler. I mean, he really got a job but it was, in other words, it wasn't just a prank. It wasn't like he was just thumbing his nose at the bourgeois expectations.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he was actually half serious and he didn't last long, but there was that sense in which, yeah.
This is a Myra Kalman drawing of the castle that he worked in, which is based on a photograph that I took when I went there to see it, you know, in the early 1990s, just because I wanted to see it. It really is a castle, and at the time I visited it, I toured it because the people who ran it, we had language barriers between the. It had a caretaker a couple who were Poles who had been German speaking but hadn't spoken German in decades, and they thought that I was like had inherited this castle and had come back to look at my inheritance, and I was trying to explain who I was and what I was doing, and so I saw the inside of it. Um,
Yeah.
it's still, I think, being used as a conference center now. At the time, it was a dormitory for a nursing school in the nearby town of Oppola.
So, I mean, I made Walser sound to be like he was a complete flop, but in fact, he got patronage from one of these wealthier literati, one of the Casera, Bruno, or was it Paul?
Both,
Oh,
you
both.
know,
So he got a
both.
monthly
Yeah.
stipend
Oh, that was from
from
Bruno.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and at one point it was taken back, but he had a monthly stipend, a sort of subsistence stipend from this wealthy man of letters, and the man of letters also published his work, right? So it was both his
Yes.
publisher and his patron,
Right.
and the work.
But that was a trap. That was a big trap, because that money and that sense of indebtedness, in the book I write about all these, these traps he fell into, the things that prevented him from having the kind of career success he was trying to. And that Casera thing, that patronage, in the end, really just, it was a terrible mistake, because he felt indebted to Bruno Casera, and Bruno Casera really put pressure on him to remain loyal. Meanwhile, the publisher Samuel Fisher, who was, just becoming the kingmaker in Germany, wanted to publish him. And out of loyalty, Walser did not switch from this publisher who could not make him famous to the publisher who probably would have succeeded in making him famous. So out of personal loyalty, sometimes that kind of personal loyalty works out fine. I think about like Yoko Tawada, who I translate, whose work I adore, and is still being published by a tiny little press in the Black Forest, Claudia Gerke, that publishes basically lesbian erotica and Yoko Tawada, and makes incredibly beautiful books. And I know that Yoko Tawada, with her international success, has had offers from other publishers, but she stays faithful to her original publisher, who makes gorgeous, gorgeous editions of her books, and it works out fine. In Walser's case, it was a mistake, because, the publisher who discovered the then unknown Thomas Mann, the then unknown Hermann Hesse, also tried to discover him and was told no thank you.
Right. I was yeah, I was really struck by that moment where he was wondering whether he had made a big mistake going with Casera rather than Fisher, and yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah. In retrospect, but of course, it's the 2020 hindsight.
Yeah.
At the time, it wasn't clear, and at the time, Mann and Hesse had just published, their first books. It wasn't like that, we had seen the kind of phenomena that was going to come out of the Fisher Publishing House.
Right. I mean, so despite this stipend, though, he's having to move and work, and there's that endless sense of restlessness with Walser. It's an exhausting story to read at one level, because he moves almost every other month of his life. I've never encountered anyone quite that restless. It's hard to imagine. It's amazing that he got anything written. He never revised, which is that was a bit of a shock.
He did revise somewhat, and there was some. He pretends like he never revises, but we do have, like The Walk, for example, this most famous novella, he published in a heavily revised version. I did a translation based on his revisions, just to show how he worked. But he doesn't revise in the way that other writers do, where they would really just take apart and reconfigure a work. He revises by combing the sentences. It's really interesting. He's interested in structure and rhythm on the sentence level, not on revisioning entire works. So that's kind of interesting. I think that's perhaps, yeah, I'm not sure, but it has something to do with his obsession with how sentences are built.
And so there's that painful sense of his moving constantly with his suitcase, and then also always being on the verge of going broke, to the point where if this were in the US, I'd say he's on the point of being homeless. I don't think it was ever quite, I don't know what sort of social safety net there was in Switzerland, but ultimately it struck me that he was looking for social safety nets in the form of employment, like underemployment. And he
Yeah.
would get a job and they'd be astonished that he would quit it and so forth. He just had this sense, there was that sense of nowhere for him to uh, have any real home for very long.
Well,
What do you,
but he got, he got in that habit as a young man where that sort of life malleability was readily available to him. He was a very good bank clerk at a time when, he was praised, those letters of recommendation, at a time when things like banking correspondence were written out by hand. This was before typewriters were doing this. Typewriters were just coming into being in this time, and for usage like that. But it used to be for him that employment was like a tram he could jump on and off of, jump off when he needed a break, jump on when he needed some money. And, he got in the habit of living in this way and finding new energy from new surroundings. And so I think, the moving a lot in his 20s was really a way for him to have new experiences. Later on, he, found that this model no longer worked for him. There was a point at which, having quit a job, he could no longer easily find one, which completely messed up, the life rhythm that he had worked out for himself. And certainly, in the 1920s, when he was in his 40s, he became all but unemployable in this kind of, jobs for which he was overqualified. He couldn't get them anymore. It was one thing to get a random job as a 20-something-year-old, and quite another as a 40-something-year-old. That wasn't done. So the one clerical post that he had in Bern, Switzerland, was really gotten for him sort of as a favor, as a personal favor through, family members. And after that, he really did have a hard time managing financially, but he worked very, very hard on selling his work and making a living as a writer. And for a long time, that did kind of work and keep him kind of, above water. I think with a little help from his friends, he did get financial help from his from one of his sisters and from another friend. Yeah.
yeah, you used the phrase he was painting himself into a corner a lot. And I think that you're kind of, you're on the trail of some notion of how his creativity worked. Like there was a certain
Yeah.
way in which precarity seemed to work to make him creative. So,
Yeah.
the one thing that he didn't, of course, construct himself was the rise of radio and cinema in the mid 1920s, which you rightfully point out made the style of writing he was getting paid for start to dry up. The feuilleton.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not that it was drying up so much as that the way he was writing was making him less appealing to some of the newspaper readership. I don't think that was entirely because of the rise of these other media, although there was certainly competition. He could have published more work in these feuilleton sections of newspapers that, for those who don't know, it's a section of the newspaper. I compared in the introduction to the New Yorker's Talk of the Town. It's, assorted short pieces, little essays on little topics, little aperçus, little, anecdotes. But he got so experimental and playful with this genre that, newspaper editors started to say things like, why don't you take a break from writing for half a year? Try us again then, which for him was catastrophic because he was paying his rent this way. I found out doing research that he had used literary agents to place such pieces in really far-flung newspapers, like in Königsberg and just places on the Baltic. which is kind of amazing because, we think of literary agents as recent phenomenon, but actually no, they did exist back then, and were apparently a really good way to get your work circulating through the newspaper market. Because if you think about it, like, a newspaper is a very ephemeral sort of publication and perhaps most read locally. So there's no reason why you can't republish something from one newspaper to another newspaper 2 countries over, say.
Right, right.
So yeah, so he was, in that way, he was very forward thinking in these very practical economic models that could bring him income as a writer. He was very proud of being a working writer and living off his writing. That was, yeah, I think that was also important to him. And so it always felt like a failure when he needed to find other forms of income.
Sure, sure. Talk a little about his walking. I mean, I know that he has that connection between, Zabald loves this about him, the walking as a form, the walking as also as a kind of another version of the restlessness and the movement. Um,
Well, a walk is in and of itself a narrative structure. A walk begins, it has a middle, it comes to an end somehow. The walker decides to turn back, or the walk, there's no walk, one could say, that doesn't tell a story of some sort, or isn't living out a sort of story. But he wrote so many narratives. I mean, his first published story, Greifensee, or Lake Greifen, is in fact, a walk story. So he was thinking about narrating walks from the very beginning. And his most famous story, of course, is the novella, The Walk, about a 60 to 100 pages, depending how you print it. But I think that the idea of walking fit very well when you think about, his moving so often, change of place as driving experience, as driving narrative. This all fits really well together. I like to think about his work as a walker too, in the context of, and contrast with, the sort of flaneur writers. So Walter Benjamin, famously a flaneur, Franz Hessel, who, knew Walser, or yeah, no, they did meet. They met in person. That's what I'm trying to remember stories from my own book. But the flaneur writers were all about, walking very slowly through cityscapes and at a leisurely pace, describing everything. And Robert Walser's walk is really about moving very fast, collecting a large number of disconnected associations, knitting them together. The narrator is often talking about haste and needing to press on, the sort of self-reflexive discussion of the speed of, the storytelling. It often plays a role there. So he differs quite a lot from these flaneur writers who approach walking, as an important form. And Zabald, I think, is kind of in between. Zabald, like Walser, I think, is more interested in landscape walking, although Walser has both the urban and the landscape walks. And Zabald, of course, is very heavily using, this framework for memory and nostalgia, which sometimes happens in Walser, not always. But the story, The Walk, the walker walks for, dozens of pages, and on the last page of the story, you learn that there is something that he's trying not to think about. So it retrospectively gives you the motivation for the entire thing. So this tension that you are feeling, the sense that, the narrator is fleeing something. He does say at the beginning, he gets up and goes out of his room of phantoms. And you think, okay, what is that? It's the thing that he doesn't want to think about, the painful memory.
You mentioned at certain points the whole concept of freedom in his, like, as a trope, but also as something he was trying to find in this kind of eccentric way of his, talk a little about that, the theme of freedom, maybe as a
Mm.
just a segue from the writing, I mean, from the walking.
Mhm.
I mean, I was thinking of it in terms of the wage slavery, just the sense of pressure he felt to make money and to take a job. So if he could
Yeah.
be free of that, but he was never really free in the sense of being free of indebtedness. He was always taking money from a patron or taking hospitality from his sister Lisa or
Well,
from the.
there were times when he was supporting himself successfully. Like in Beale, for example, he had many good years there where he had enough newspaper income. You know, certainly before the war, World War I just put a whole, like, not just a monkey wrench, but like a jackhammer to his life, because, you know, not only was there no paper for printing and, you know, publications were folding left and right, but also, you know, the German mark became worthless, and without being able to sell anything in Germany, you couldn't print something in Switzerland. And it was, you know, that whole, but before the war, there was this, you know, period that, you know, he was quite happily supporting himself by his pen and living in a relatively inexpensive situation at the Hotel Blaues Kreuz, the Blue Cross Hotel in Biel. And it was all working kind of well. And I think that he did feel a sort of freedom there. You know, he had a room in the sort of the maids' quarters area, but got fed. You know, he had, you know, board as well as lodging. Somebody cooked for him. He could go out as he pleased. He had enough money to get by, you know, and I think that that was perhaps the greatest period of freedom he experienced since the time when he was young and was feeling this heady freedom that, you know, he could go anywhere and do anything because he didn't need anything. Um, but that became much trickier near the end of his life when the income just wasn't coming in regularly, and that was tricky. And, you know, there's a period when he was also drinking much too much, and that was expensive, and that, you know, that turned into the downward spiral that landed him in an institutional context in the end. Which is, you know, when you mention the theme of freedom, I'm of course thinking of the last third of his life, which he spent, you know, in, you know, the epitome of unfreedom, really, as a patient, and for much of that time, most of that time, is an involuntary patient, and
Mhm.
one who, in fact, you know, in retrospect, didn't necessarily require long-term institutionalization at all. So,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, you make a good point about the usefulness he served to them because he was working at the asylum, he was doing chores, he was also bringing in a bit of money, he was another bed. There's an institutional kind of incentive to hang on to him. Yeah.
yeah, he fit well in that institutional economy. You know, in in the end, it also served him in some way to be there. You know, there were periods where, you know, his guardian, who also recorded a lot of conversations with him when they went out for walks, this Walks with Walser book, would ask, well, would you like to leave? And he would say yes, and then not follow up.
Hmm.
You know, so there was a certain ambivalence there in
And
the end.
this is when he starts really writing in pencil. I mean, I know he started writing in pencil earlier, but there's this transition where he reacts to the pressure to write and the pressure to produce a novel by getting a kind of cramp in his hand when he writes with a pen, right? He has kind of
Yeah,
what you call writer's cramp, and he starts to use a pencil as a way around not being able
yeah.
to hold his pen. And this takes flower in the asylum, right? That's where he really produces all of those pencil works.
No, in fact, the vast majority of microscripts we have were produced in the 1920s before he entered the asylum. There are some that we have from the first asylum, the Waldau, where he only stayed, you know, from 1929 to 1933. But, you know, the following 23 years, the longer period where he spent at Harizal, we don't have any at all. But since he began drafting everything that he wrote, you know, in this pencil, in this pencil form, which are, gorgeous. Maybe I'll show one of them for in case anybody doesn't know what they look like. I don't know if this will show up on the Zoom, but here's a facsimile reproduction. You can Google microscripts and find some images of these, but this is writing 1 to 2 millimeters in height. Really just kind of mind-blowing to look at these items. And if you see them in person, they're three-dimensional because he really gets in there with the pencil. But he was drafting this, in this form really for 2 decades before he entered the asylum. But that, it's long been a connection people make, the weird teensy tiny writing, the institutionalization, these things are inviting to put together, but it's again part of the myth, part of the mystique around him. Yeah.
And why do you think that the his executor or his comrade there's Zelig, why did he want to destroy them? Did he feel like they must be hiding something scandalous, or what was his motive, do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, I write about
that
this
story a little bit.
Yeah, I wrote a bit about this in the book. So Carl Zelig, who was a sort of lesser light sort of literary figure who was, however, very good at bureaucracy and had money, and genuinely helped Walser a lot and published his work while he was institutionalized and all that. Robert Walser clearly did not trust him enough to tell him about these manuscripts that he somehow had with him in the asylum. We're not even sure how, because, it isn't clear how a patient could have had private possessions that the staff wouldn't know about, but somehow he had a little stash of these manuscripts with him. And Carl Zelig clearly did not know that these were manuscripts. So there's correspondence between Carl Zelig after Robert Walser's death with Walser's sister Lisa talking about these manuscripts. Neither of them really think that it's genuine writing. So Carl Zelig published them and in sort of a enlarged facsimile the year after Walser's death, saying that these were documents written in secret code, as a display of, what he called madness, right? And so this association of the tiny writing and mental illness was cemented right then and has kind of stuck. Even though the enlarged facsimile that he published made it possible to see that, in fact, this was writing, ordinary German writing, just radically shrunk. So it's all really complicated. So it's like a secret that he carried with him to the grave. And these manuscripts were not deciphered, most of them, until the 1980s,
And so the whole thing with the cramping, he overcame with the pencil, right? The pencil was a looser form for him.
Yeah, well, but that's how he explained it. It may not have been exactly the way he himself explained it, but that's how he explained it.
But Zelig's desire to burn them is a mystery. We don't know why.
No, I think that he was probably afraid that they would, Zelig marketed Walser in a certain way, very aggressively, which I write about. He had a very distinct image that he was selling, that he was marketing of Robert Walser. And I think he was afraid that this work would be crazy, what he would think of as crazy, and that work would stand in contrast with what, the image of Walser that he had been presenting, that would embarrass him, embarrass Walser, if that, whatever sense that makes to say but to somehow, soil his image, the image that Carl Zelig had carefully curated of Walser. So
well, let's pause and take some questions here. We have one related to this notion of the microscripts from Shelby White, who asks, what kind of papers did he leave?
So
aside from scopes?
yeah, so the papers that he left that were in his possession were really very, very few. He had gotten into the habit of offloading papers with his sister, and so his sister, who actually predeceased him but passed things on to the other to his younger sister Fanny. So there were letters that had survived and documents like that, and also fair copy manuscripts. And a number of fair copy manuscripts survived in publishing houses. But Robert Walser had never been someone who kept things. He didn't even keep with him copies of his own published books. And so, in the correspondence, one finds again and again, for example, asking his sister or his female friend, Frida Mermet, to send him the magazine copies of his stories that he had sent to them for safekeeping because he wanted to assemble them into a book. And so, the bulk of the papers, like in the Robert Walser archives, have come from different places, from the archives of publishing houses, letters written by him that were kept by the recipients. There were very, very few letters to him because he tended not to keep them, or he recycled them to write microscripts on the back. There's a lot of, there are a lot of letters that we have just because he used the paper for something else afterwards. But it's a very scattered archive, as it were. So there are a lot of gaps to fill in, frustratingly. Yeah. But there's also been some decades of Swiss and German scholars sort of scouring the archives in Germany and Switzerland, in search of papers pertaining to Walser, and things are still coming to light. If you subscribe to the newsletter of the Robert Walser Foundation, every year there are new discoveries, things that are even now coming to light.
Did he ever have any romances in his life? This is a question from David Levine.
Yes, he clearly did, but if he had consummated romances, we don't really know. He certainly had flirtations with a range of people, including people of different genders. He had a long-standing romantic friendship with a close friend of his sister's named Frida Mermet that I talk about a lot, who worked in the laundry at in a different psychiatric hospital where his sister Lisa also worked as a school teacher, teaching the kids of the hospital staff. But they had a very long epistolary friendship and also some intense in-person flirtation. And there was some talk of their marrying, which never came to pass, but might have. She was a very important friend to him. And yeah, I write quite a bit about that because it was one of the key friendships in his life.
But he never married.
No, he never married.
And he never really cohabitated with a partner.
No.
Right.
Never.
So what do you think of as where do you see his reputation right now, and how do you see your book relative to a revaluation of him, and what are you hoping for him as someone who's not nearly as well known as Kafka or Musil or these people or even Benjamin?
I think that there's a generational shift going on there. So, for someone of our generation, Kafka was a lodestar, and you would certainly not try and be a writer without thoroughly immersing yourself in Kafka's work. And I'm finding now, teaching in an MFA creative writing program, my students are more likely to have read Walser than Kafka. It's an interesting shift, which, that was certainly not the case, when I was studying for my MFA. But I would say that Walser is very popular among newer generation, people who are closer to 30 than they are to, 50. And there is something about his vagabondage and his playfulness and his shape-shifting and his, sometimes blog-like writing that takes that kind of wallpapering of the world with your quotidian experience to really quirky, stylistically challenging heights. So I think he's a very good writer for our moment. Also, if you think about, the notion of modesty and smallness that he does champion in his work, he's a good, antidote for what's going on in the world these days. And so, I do think that he still is a writer whose work makes one curious about who he is. And I'm hoping that my book will serve readers who get that itch reading his work to see who he was. I did do my best to, make a case for why I love his work, writing about his literary contribution. But that's, for every reader, I think, to decide for themselves how they are going to respond to him. But I do think that he's, much more widely recognized as a writer than he was, say, a quarter century ago.
Right. Well, I think your book is going to establish him as, in a lot of ways, a very pure, even though there's a lot of struggle and a lot of, toward the end when he was having his breakdown, some ugliness. There was also a great deal of purity to his mission as an
Yeah,
artist, and
it's
I
true.
think it seems to hold up under your scrutiny. And the book is really rigorous, and you turn over all the stones. And there is, in terms of a contemporary issue, there's also the notion of gender for him. Maybe you could talk a little about that.
Yeah, we didn't get into that at all. And that was a challenging chapter to write too, because he writes about experiencing feelings of gender fluidity, but at a time when somebody who wanted to write about that now would have a whole vocabulary and a whole part of a contemporary discourse around that, and he didn't really, but was really writing about feeling himself not necessarily as male or masculine. And he writes so interestingly about that, from, in a way, sort of groping to understand this set of feelings. And he wrote about it at most length in his novel, The Robber, which was the one manuscript that he wrote in microscript form and never copied out to send to publishers. Ordinarily he would make these tiny pencil first drafts and then make a fair copy with pen to show people and try and get published. This novel he never copied out. Did he decide while he was writing it that he was never going to publish it, and did that give him the freedom to write really more self-exposingly? I don't know. But I think I do think that is a really important aspect of his work, and also one that makes him very relevant today when we're looking for writers who provide a literary history for thinking about gender fluidity.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I was really struck by that. I thought you did a really good sort of delicate job with it, without
Thank you.
straining for any particular direction. The final photo of him,
Mm.
where he's, maybe you can tell the story of his death. I don't know whether that photo is considered controversial. I get the impression Coetzee considers it kind of in poor taste or something, but I didn't feel that way about it when I saw it. What is talk about
Yeah,
his death and the way he dies on a walk? So
he does on a walk. I mean, he has what one might call a very good death, if we're speaking of those things. He died at age 78, which at the time was older than, in 1956, to die at 78 was, more like dying at, 90 now, right? But he had a instantly fatal heart attack while out for a walk in the snow, after having suffered from heart disease for some years, but not having wanted to be held back by that from his activity. So he was living kind of on his own terms within his life in the asylum. The photograph, I myself have struggled with overuse of that photograph. So, he fell down and died in the snow while taking a walk. And there's it's actually a series of several photographs that were taken by the police examiner who came to, you know, document the dead body in the snow before, you know, taking him away to the morgue. And so it's a little, you know, it's a little gruesome, this there's such a fascination with this photograph, you know, of the dead writer. And we think, okay, you know, it's, people get chills because there is a scene in his first novel, The Tanners, in which a young poet is discovered lying dead in the snow, in a scene that seems to recall this one. So there is a certain, like, you know, creepy foreboding in his own work of this death. But I share Katsia's feeling of uneasiness about this photo, because it's so personal. It's personal and clinical, and it's so private, you know. And I've seen it used, you know, there's a book of, you know, Elfriede Jelinek published, you know, an anthology of some of her favorite writers once, and this photo was on the front cover. And it just seems, you know, reißerisch. It's melodramatic. It's a violation of privacy. I have all these feelings about it. However, it's an important part of the Walser mystique. And so after thinking about whether to put it in the book, I thought, you know, Biography of all places is where this photograph actually belongs. So I put the photograph in the book and then wrote about it, you know. Yeah. But it makes me uncomfortable to look at the photo even today.
Yeah, it's an interesting test of something. I mean, I think there is a way in which biography as a form is so all-inclusive. So even if it's problematic, you want to include it to be complete. Yeah.
Yeah, and that photograph marks the hinge between the before and after of his life. You know, I write an epilogue, which is what happened after he died. You know, a very short epilogue, but that, you know, that the photo is the hinge.
And what do you think, if everyone's familiar with Kafka, and we say Kafkaesque, if you were to say, well, what's Walserian? What does what quality, aesthetic quality or characteristic what is Walserian?
Yeah, the Walserian, I think, is the kind of flight of fancy within language that sort of makes linguistic curlicues surround something that's in and of itself very ordinary, creating this ironic, disbalance in a way that's really playful and joy-filled. For me, that's what's Walserian.
Beautiful. Now, how long did it take you to write this? Talk about an impolite question.
Ooh, well, I mean, the short answer is a decade.
Right.
But, you know, I think longer, but, you know, I will say, you know, one of the first things that happened to me during my year at the Leanne Levy Center, which was 2012 to 2013, is that I showed Gary Giddens a chapter of my work in progress and got feedback from him and proceeded to tear it up and start writing the book over from scratch. So in a sense, I didn't begin until 2012, but I wrote pieces of it. In fact, you know, the introductions to both Microscripts and Berlin Stories were written. I thought that I was writing them as sort of pieces of what would later become a biography. So, you know, so
True.
Let's just say a decade.
Nice round figure.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I spent the last 10 months I was working on it, cutting the book by a third. So I spent a long time unwriting the book.
Interesting.
You know, I overwrote, and then, you know,
back.
I turned in a 205,000 word manuscript, and my wonderful editor, Jennifer Banks, read it and sent me a note saying, I love every word you wrote. Can you cut it by a quarter? You know, cue the nervous breakdown, and this can't happen. And then, but when I started looking at her notes and thinking about it, I wound up cutting even more than she had asked for, because there was a little too much air in the book. It needed to be condensed. So well, I think this is a much condensed version.
Beautiful, beautiful book. Great achievement. Great cover.
Thank you.
Great title. And that's a Zabald quote, right? Clairvoyant of the soul.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
and it's a Jenny Wolfowski cover.
yeah, beautiful book. I just put the link up here for bookshop.org. Please, everyone, order a copy. And Susan, thank you so much for coming to the Leon Levy Center again, at least virtually.
Thank you so much. That it was such a treat to get to launch my book with you. And
Oh, I'm
thank
so
you.
flattered this was the launch. I hadn't realized.
Today's pub, it's the pub
Oh, that's
date.
right. We
This
set
is
this
the
up. I
launch.
should know.
Yeah, yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah.
So thank you for helping me launch this book.
Oh, well, congratulations and good luck with it.
Thank you so, so much. Thank you. And thank
Good
you
night,
everyone for
everyone.
coming. Thank you for helping me launch my book.
See you soon.
Okay,
Bye
bye.
bye.